Today, we are talking about a subject that I think demands your attention. We are talking about death, resurrection, and eternity. Pastor Trevor is going to be talking about this subject with the rest of our locations as we continue in our series, Redeeming Dogma. I'd also like to take a moment to remind you of a way that you can take this hopeful and helpful content with you throughout your week. Thank you for joining us here today, and welcome to SMCC Online. Before we join Pastor Trevor and the rest of our locations today, I want to remind you about something important. In a message like today, we're covering a subject that is pretty broad and has a lot of different things tied to it, a lot of questions that you may have. You might even leave this message saying, hey, I'd like to know more about this. And we have to tackle a subject like this in just 30 minutes. And that sometimes can be even a little bit difficult or tricky. So I want to remind you something important. You can take hopeful and helpful content like this with you throughout the week. And we have a podcast, it's called the Fully Delighted Podcast, that right now is in a season where we're going to dive deeper into each subject that we're covering in the Redeeming Dogma series. So this week, on this Wednesday, it comes out every Wednesday, but this Wednesday, we will actually be talking with Pastor Trevor and Pastor Eric more in depth about the subject of death, resurrection, and eternity. So if you go through a message like this and you say, this is really interesting, I want to know more, then you should subscribe to the Fully Delighted Podcast. And you can find it a couple of different ways. You can go into your podcast app on your phone and search the Fully Delighted Podcast, or search SMCC or South Mountain Community Church. You can find it. Or if you would like the direct links to those podcasts, you can go ahead and visit smccutah.org/podcast. And just as well, if you would like hopeful and helpful content in your news feed and your social media, we have an option for that as well. I'd like to invite you to go ahead and follow and like us on social media, on Facebook and Instagram if you haven't done that already. That helps us out, and it might help you out as well, having that hopeful and helpful content coming up in your social media feed. So search for South Mountain Community Church on Facebook or on Instagram, or you can just find the direct links at smccutah.org/social. Well, it's about that time to go ahead and join Pastor Trevor and our rest of our locations as we're continuing through this series, and we are going to be talking about, like I said, death, resurrection, and eternity. So let's join Pastor Trevor now.
God himself, the Ancient of Days, the God who was there before time had a name, the God that keeps his universe on track to show us that he's running things, reigning supreme, chose to put on human clothes. He put his back on the line so our nature would be put back in line with his. He swallowed the backwash of our sins for our sake. His back was placed on the cross. When the sky turned black, the Father turned his back on his son's face. Tears began to run back into her eyes. His eyes began to roll back into his face. The preacher continued to tell them how Christ stayed in the cave for 3 days and proceeded to backslap death in the face from the grave. He got raised like a backward sunset, and that anyone that wanted forgiveness for their wicked ways just had to call on Jesus' name and they would be saved.
Hey, thanks for joining us. My name is Trevor. I serve as one of the pastors here at SMCC, and I'm curious, when is the first time in your life that you were introduced to death? Or when is the first time that you encountered death, that you were faced with the truth of your own mortality? I remember one time when I was about 5 years old, there was one particular evening where my parents, they must have been just tired and worn out after a long day, and they were watching this movie starring Gene Hackman. It was not Hoosiers. If it was Hoosiers, it would be an entirely different story. But in this movie, Gene Hackman was playing this character, this man who was on death row, and he was coming near to the end of his life when he would face capital punishment for the crimes that he had been convicted of, the crimes that he had committed. And now, hear me, in no way, shape, or form is this a movie that my parents would have ever allowed me to watch at this age. But what happened on this particular night is they were so tired, so worn out, that they actually fell asleep right in the middle of the movie. And at some point after that, their 5-year-old son wandered out, plopped down on the living room floor, and continued to watch as the movie played out before me. And in the closing scenes of the movie, what you see is Gene Hackman, his character, actually being brought down into the gas chamber, strapped down, and you see his execution take place in a pretty wildly graphic way, at least in my 5-year-old memory and imagination. And so I remember that was the first time I had ever encountered death, the first time I had ever seen someone die, or at least the portrayal of someone dying. But in my mind, this was Gene Hackman dying. And what my parents found is they woke up to not only the final end credits of the movie rolling on the screen, but to their 5-year-old son bawling, just sobbing, because I had seen someone die for the very first time, and it terrified me. Right? It was terrifying. And I think that's true for a lot of us, that when we first encounter death, it's such a confusing, such a frightening, such a scary thing. And I think the truth of the matter is, right, that's how it felt when I was 5 years old. And to some extent, time and age and the years that have gone by have not softened the blow, because death demands our attention. Death, the truth of our own mortality, the reality that we will all one day face our death, and then whatever's on the other side, that demands our attention. And it raises a question for us. The question primarily being, what happens after I die? What happens after I die? What's waiting for me on the other side? Is there anything at all? And I think whatever you turn to answer that question is a belief, a core belief, that not only your life, but even what happens after this life is built upon perhaps even your eternity. And I think for that reason, right, we owe it to ourselves, whether you're a Christian or not, whether you deal with the Bible or not, regardless of who you are and what you believe, you owe it to yourself to come up with the best answer you can to that question. What happens to me after I die? Because there's a lot riding on your answer. And so I think that a lot of common answers, a lot of the ways that people approach that question is to say that after we die, right, of all of the answers that are out there, it's either nothing, no one, something, or someone. Right, what happens after I die? It's either nothing, no one, something, or someone. And that's what I want to unpack here today. Because here at SMCC, we're going through this series right now called Redeeming Dogma, where we're going through our doctrinal statement as a church, our set of 8 core beliefs that SMCC has always been built upon. And the goal for the series is really to take each one of those beliefs individually, to unpack it and explain this is what it means, this is why we believe it, this is why we've built our church upon it, and also, this is why it's worth building your life upon it also. And our belief for today has everything to do with answering that question: what happens after I die? And so let me read the statement for us here. This is the 5th statement in our set of 8 that says this: we believe in the resurrection of both the saved and the lost. Those that are saved to the resurrection of eternal life, and those that are lost to the resurrection of condemnation and eternal separation from God. Right, we believe in the resurrection of both the saved, those who have trusted in Jesus, and the lost, those who have not. Right, those that have trusted him to the resurrection of eternal life, and those that have not to the resurrection of condemnation and eternal separation from God. In other words, we believe in a real heaven and in a real hell, that there are 2 ultimate destinations for every single person. Now, over the next 30 minutes or so, I want to unpack that further and show why this belief is actually a very hopeful and a helpful answer when we're confronted with that question: what happens after I die? And so to unpack that, the first thing I want to do is just to kind of set the stage a little bit by jumping into some biblical ideas. The first of which come in the book of Romans chapter 5, which is actually a letter in its entirety. The book of Romans is a letter that was written by a man named Paul, who was an author who authored much of the New Testament. And in this particular letter, he's writing to the church located in Rome. And what he's saying to them in this particular chapter, chapter 5, is he's drawing this distinction between two different people, between Jesus on the one hand and Adam on the other. And he's comparing and contrasting the two of them in order to explain some things about reality. And so with that, this is what he says, Romans chapter 5, verse 17. He says, "For if by the trespass of the one man," meaning Adam, "death reigned through that one man," right? So he's starting with this if statement, but this is the point he's already established, that through Adam's sin, through Adam's trespass, death entered into the human experience. And now, ever since then, death has been something that happens to every single person. He's saying that that's in a point he's already established, and he's building on that logic here. So he says, "For if by the trespass of the one man, death reigned through that one man over all of humanity, how much more will those who receive God's abundant provision of grace and the gift of righteousness," right? In other words, he's talking about those who have trusted in Jesus. How much more will those who have trusted in Jesus reign in life, right? Not just for a season or for a lifetime, but reign in life forever through the one man, Jesus Christ, through what Jesus has done, what he has accomplished on our behalf. Consequently, just as one trespass resulted in condemnation for all people, so also one righteous act resulted in justification in life for all people. And the thing about that second "for all people," if you look at the context, he's very clearly talking about those who have trusted in Jesus. But the prior statement there that he makes is that one trespass resulted in condemnation for everyone, for all of humanity. And I think sometimes, right, in kind of the modern West, we can hear that, and that idea that something that a person did who lived thousands of years ago in a different culture, a different language, different time period, that something that they did can have such a drastic effect on us that we could stand condemned before God because of this guy's mistake. How does that make any sense whatsoever, right? I think that is a difficult thing for us to kind of reconcile sometimes in the modern West. It doesn't feel right. It doesn't seem fair. And yet, I think it's a reality that we see playing out all the time, right? That we are impacted by the decisions and the things that others do who have come before us, right? The decisions in the lives that your parents have lived and that your grandparents have lived have had a massive effect on you. So this is just an aspect of reality, fair or not, that we see playing out all the time around us. But what this is saying, to dive a little bit deeper into some of the theology here, is that Adam and Eve, if you go all the way back to the beginning of the Bible, the first book, Genesis, chapters 2 and 3, God gives Adam this command that in the garden that he is living in, a garden in a place called Eden, there are all of these trees that produce this fruit. And Adam is free to eat from any of the trees, but there is one tree that God places a command over saying, "You shall not eat from this tree. You're not to eat the fruit that this tree produces." And in essence, what God is saying to him there is that you have the opportunity to trust me and to be in relationship with me and to live in the way that I have designed you for, right? I'm commanding you to live in the way that is for your best, or you can choose to reject that, to reject me, to eat from the fruit of this tree. And in doing so, it's almost as if you're stepping into this pit, right? That there's this huge, massive hole. And when you eat from that tree and you break the command and you reject me, you'll be stepping into that pit. And once you're there, you will not be able to get out, right? You'll be entirely unable to deliver yourself from that pit. And that is the place where shame and where guilt and where fear and brokenness will have their way, because it is a place that is cut off from me, that is separated from relationship with me. And again, you will not be able to get out. So it was a warning. And unfortunately, as the narrative continues, we see that they ate from the fruit of the tree. They stepped into the hole that they were entirely unable to get out of. And therefore, since all of humanity has come from them, right, we are born into the state that they placed themselves in. Right? And so we're born into the state of condemnation simply because we're born into the same pit that Adam and Eve stepped into when they ate the fruit of the tree and they rejected God's authority. And so it may not seem fair, it may not feel right, and yet we see that reality playing out, that we are impacted by the decisions that others have made before us. So we see that explained in Romans chapter 5, and we also see it in the book of John, chapter 3, verses 16 and 18, that also provides a solution to this. And this is what it says. John 3:16. It says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send his son," meaning Jesus, God did not send Jesus into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. All right, now notice this, whoever believes in him is not condemned. And so what Jesus came to provide in his life and his death and his resurrection is a way out of the pit, a way to enter back into relationship with God, a way to not be condemned, a way to move back into the relationship with God that we were created for. And when we trust in Jesus, that's what occurs in our lives. But notice that it says this too, that whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe stands condemned already, because they have not believed in the name of God's one and only Son. Right? What this is saying is that Jesus didn't come into the world in order to condemn us. It's that we were already condemned, and Jesus stepped into the world to provide a solution because there was none. Right? There was no solution, there was no hope, there was no opportunity, and Jesus stepped in to provide a way. In other words, Jesus is the only solution to the problem that humanity was already in. Jesus is the only solution to the problem that humanity was and is already in. Right? It's as if all of humanity was in a train barreling down the tracks towards one particular destination, right? Eternal separation from God, this condemnation, and Jesus stepped in to provide a way off of that train towards a far different end, a far better end, in the end that we were actually designed for and made for. And so Jesus is the only solution to the problem that humanity was and is already in. Now, maybe you're asking the question, hey, I thought this sermon was about death and what happens after. And so why are you opening with all of this, right? I think the truth is that this sets the stage for us to really answer the question well and to tackle the problem in a way that is well thought out and intentional. Because what this shows us is that all of humanity is really in moving towards two different destinations, right? That when it comes to eternity, every single person is moving towards one of two destinations, right? That of those who are still in the pit and those who have trusted in Jesus. In other words, there is heaven and there is hell. And so how do you know what happens to you after you die? According to the gospel and according to the Bible, it depends entirely and absolutely on what you do with Jesus, right? That is the only question that matters when it comes to determining what your eternity will be. Is it heaven or is it hell? Now, what I want to do is spend kind of the rest of our time unpacking each of those and spending some more time developing an understanding of what each of them actually are. And so I want to start first with heaven. And looking into that, I want to pick it up with another passage written by that the same guy, Paul, in a different letter, 1 Corinthians 15, where he says this. He says, I declare to you, brothers and sisters, writing to the church located in the ancient city of Corinth. He says, I declare to you that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, talking about heaven, right? As we'll see as he continues to write. Nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. Listen, I tell you a mystery, he says. We will not all sleep, meaning we won't all die, but we will all be changed in a flash, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. In other words, what he's saying here is that those who have trusted in Jesus, when you die, you actually go to be with Jesus, right? In kind of this intermediate state. But there's a certain point that arises, a certain point in time that we look forward to, right? When all of us will be raised back to life, and not into these same kind of flawed and broken bodies that we're living in now, but raised in these bodies that are no longer perishable, but are imperishable. Right? Meaning no longer are they subject to things like disease and death and dysfunction and all of these other things, but these bodies are perfected and imperishable. And these are the bodies that we are resurrected into for all of eternity. And so that marks our experience of heaven. Now, does that mean that we're all going to be cover models, right? Not necessarily, not exactly, but I think what this means is that we'll all have the bodies and even the personalities to some extent will become the people that we were always intended to be. We'll experience the fullness of what we were always and who we were always intended to become. And so that's one piece of it. but also we're resurrected into these perfected, imperishable bodies in the midst of a world that you could say is resurrected also. And we see that described here in another passage. Revelation 21 verses 1 through 4 says this: "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth, the ones we currently live in, had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them.'" Right, following the logic, Adam and Eve, when they sinned, right, they put us in the pit, in the place of separation from God. And yet what Jesus has done is brought about this possibility that we can trust in him and be raised back to life and experience this, that one day we'll have the restoration fully and finally of the relationship with God that we were made for, where his dwelling place will be among the people, among us, and he will dwell with us. It goes on to say that they will be his people, and God himself will be with them, will be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. And that is the description of heaven, that fully and finally we will be with God. And I think heaven, more than anything else, is marked by the perfect presence of God that we're created for. Now, all that being said, I think there is one kind of interesting tension within Christianity that sometimes Christians will feel. And it's that it's easier to believe in heaven than it is to actually be excited about it. I think if we're honest, it's easier to believe in it than it is to actually be excited about it, to actually think about heaven and have some emotion, some energy, some excitement looking forward to what that will be. And I think there's a couple of things that play into that, right? On the one hand, the language that the Bible uses to describe heaven sometimes I think can, in some ways it struggles to describe what heaven will actually be like, right? Even later on in the passage we just read, it talks about the new Jerusalem being surrounded and covered in these gems and these jewels like sapphires and emeralds and all these different things, which sounds shiny and expensive and beautiful, but it might not exactly sound like the most exciting thing. And so how are we to actually understand heaven? Because I think what we see in these passages is that heaven is beyond the ability of human language to describe. Heaven is beyond the ability of human language to describe. And sometimes we see our language straining to make sense and even to describe and to help us to imagine what it will be like. And I think that makes it difficult to really get excited about it sometimes, right? But just for a moment, let's just do a little thought experiment with me for a moment here, right? Just if you could suspend your disbelief with me for a moment and just pretend that maybe you took a weekend trip a week ago, or maybe in 6 months, you take a weekend trip over to Wendover, right? And you pick up a lotto ticket while you're there. And it turns out that you just happen to have the winning numbers, right? And so you win the prize, the jackpot. Except instead of it being an actual lottery with money, what you have won instead of cash is actually the opportunity to be a part of the first ever expedition to Mars. Right, that's what you have won. Now, hear me. We're suspending disbelief here, right, for the sake of this thought experiment. And so you say yes, right, because there's insurance covered, there's all expenses paid, all inclusive, everything is managed. And so you're going on this expedition to Mars. You enter into 6 months to a year of training. You're going over physics and gravity and mechanics and how to handle the shuttle and all of this stuff. And then finally, the day arrives for you to actually lift off. And you're inside the shuttle, the countdown is happening, you got Instagram Live open, you're working that, trying to get that blue check mark, and all of a sudden, the thrusters take off, and you lift off away from this earth, away from this life that you have always known. You leave the atmosphere, and you find yourselves in the deep, dark depths of space. And it's at this point that one of your fellow astronauts, right, your fellow lottery ticket winners, looks over at you and says, "Hey, so what do you know about Mars?" And you think for a moment and you say, I actually don't know that much, but I guess we'll find out what it's like when we get there, right? That would be unthinkable, right? To think that you would go through 6 months to a year of training, knowing that you're going on the first ever expedition to this place. It's where you're heading to, and you know not a thing about what it's actually going to be like. But the thing is, I think what's true is that for people who believe in heaven, Christians, I think sometimes we can do that very same thing. To know that we're heading towards heaven, to believe that, and yet know almost nothing about it. And so what I would say is sometimes the thought that fills our minds when we're thinking what heaven is like is just sort of like we're hanging out on the clouds. There's these little baby cherubs with the wings playing the harps, and you just sort of chill out there, right? In the sun on top of the clouds. And let me say that if you want to know what heaven is actually going to be like, I think the best way to imagine it, to understand it, is to look at it kind of through this lens, right? That just look at your life now, right? Look at the life that you have had, the life that you've lived, the life that you are currently living, and imagine the relationships, the community, the work, everything that you're a part of. What would all of that be like if sin were removed, if destruction were removed, if corruption were removed, if all of the damaging and destructive and detrimental things of this life were removed from the picture, and you took everything that was left and elevated it to the highest degree of flourishing? What would that be like? And I think that, more than anything else, helps us to grasp what heaven will actually be like. This life, this world, absent any sin or corruption whatsoever, and elevated with the perfection of God's full presence to the highest degree of flourishing. And I don't know about you, but that right there, that picture helps me to get excited and to feel good and to feel some energy about what we believe about where we're going. And so all that to say, heaven is one of the two destinations that the Bible describes for humans when it talks about what happens to us in eternity and after we die. So now, what I want to do is move into the alternative, because heaven is one of two, but there are two, and we'd be remiss to at least not move into talking about that other one. And I think really the best way to understand hell, in contrast with heaven, is to say that if heaven is the place of God's perfect presence, then hell is the place of God's complete absence. If heaven is the place of God's perfect presence, then hell is the place of God's complete and utter absence, right? Which means there is no relationship with God there whatsoever. And at the same time, all of the good things, everything that is good, everything that is beautiful, everything that is worth enjoying in this life is actually a gift given to us from God. And hell, for that very reason, will be absent of every single one of those, right? Because it is the place of God's complete and utter absence. And so I want to walk through some passages that explain that a little bit further. And I just want to acknowledge right at the top here too that I'm presenting a particular view on hell and on eternity for in this particular way, and within the scope of orthodoxy, right, within accepted beliefs by the Christian church, that there is some difference of opinion here. So I want to acknowledge that and say that what I'm presenting is the historic view of hell. And I just want to acknowledge that. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into it, look at the passages, and unpack this a little bit more together. So starting with Matthew chapter 25, we see these two destinations called out here. This is what it says in verse 31. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne, right? This is in reference to Jesus. When he will sit on his throne, and all of the nations, all of the people groups, every person from humanity will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats, meaning he will separate all of humanity into two different categories. And he will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. And then the king will say to those on his right, to the sheep, to those who have trusted in Jesus as their ultimate authority, he'll say to them, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world," right? Heaven is what that is saying. And then a little bit later on in the passage, he goes on to describe the alternative, right? Hell. This is what he says, verse 41. Then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you who are cursed. Move away from my presence. Go to the place that is marked by the complete absence of my presence. You who are cursed," right? You who are condemned and have refused the only opportunity out of the condemnation that you are already in. And so depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. This is verse 41. Verse 46, he adds this a little bit later in the chapter. Then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. And so we see within this passage the two destinations. And hell is described with this language of eternal punishment and even of eternal fire. Now, I don't think that means that hell actually has literal flames, that there's actual fire there. I think it's just imagery and language being used to describe a place of great pain, a place that is absent of anything good or enjoyable whatsoever, a place that is anything but pleasant to go to. And so we see Jesus describing it there in those words. And then elsewhere in the New Testament, he actually references this particular physical location, this actual valley that's located in the land of Israel that had a certain reputation in the first century to communicate something about hell. And this is what he says. This is one of the places where he references it. Matthew 5:29 and 30. He says this, "If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell." All right, now, just a quick clarifying note. In this passage, Jesus is using something called hyperbole, which is just exaggerated language that's used to make a point. So he's not actually directing or instructing anyone to actually gouge out their eye or to cut off their hand, right? So nobody do that, essentially, is what I'm saying. That's exaggerated language used to make a point. And the point that he's trying to make is that he wants people to be so willing to address the sin in their lives. He's just expressing the gravity about that point. But notice in the passage, right, for our purposes, what he's saying is that you don't want to be thrown into hell, right? That hell is not a place that you want to go to. And what's interesting is in other translations of the Bible, they'll actually translate this as Gehenna, which is the physical location. It's a valley that was located near the city of Jerusalem. And that's actually what Jesus is saying here. He's saying the word Gehenna. And the Gehenna was a place in the Old Testament in the centuries leading up to the first century when Jesus said these things, when he taught this. There were some really horrific things that happened in the midst of the Old Testament where there were children who were actually sacrificed. Their lives were taken as a form of dedication to these other false gods in this particular valley. And after that, really what it had turned into was this just this dump, right? This garbage. And that's what it was in the time of Jesus in the first century. That it was just this absolute dump where people would throw their trash and there were maggots everywhere, all throughout the garbage, littered through the valley. And it was always constantly burning and smoldering with this fire that never went out. It was probably the least desirable place that anybody would ever want to go on the earth. And that's what Jesus is communicating, that hell is like that. Hell is like the valley of Gehenna, this awful, horrible smelling, filthy, disgusting place that you do not want to go to. And that's the point that he's trying to communicate. And I think what we see when we look at hell from a broader perspective, looking at it from the course of the whole Bible, is that it's essentially a quarantine for evil. Right? That hell is a quarantine for evil. Right? That as we move into eternity, hell is the place where all of evil will be sectioned off and quarantined away from the rest of creation for all of eternity. And so that's what hell is. It's a quarantine for evil. And the Bible describes this really clearly, that there are these two different destinations. And we even saw in Matthew 25 it referencing this particular time when Jesus will sit upon his throne and separate people into these two different categories, these two different destinations. And there's one other passage that I want to touch on that hits on this as well in an important way. And it's Revelation chapter 20, verses 11 to 15. It says this. It says, "Then I saw a great white throne, and him who was seated on it," that being Jesus. "The earth and the heavens fled from his presence, and there was no place for them," meaning there's no place to escape his attention, no place to escape what is taking place here, this great white throne judgment. And it goes on to say that, "And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened." So all of humanity resurrected back to life, standing before Jesus at this throne. And these books are open. And these books contain within them a record of the lives that we have lived. They're a record of our merits. But then it says this, "Another book was opened, which is the book of life. And in the context, what we learn that the book of life is the book that contains the names of every person who has trusted in Jesus. That's what the book of Revelation explains. And so what it goes on to say here is that the dead were judged. All of humanity was judged according to what they had done as recorded in the books that record their own merits. The sea gave up the dead that were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them. And each person was judged according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. The lake of fire is the second death, that is hell. And anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. Anyone whose name was not written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. What this is saying is that anyone who attempts to stand before God on the basis of their own merits in this judgment will fall drastically short of the standard. No matter how good you are, no matter how righteous you are, no matter what you've done, not even Mother Teresa herself is good enough when standing before the God who is perfectly holy, perfectly righteous, perfectly just, right? That there is no one who is good enough on the basis of their own merits. And so what this is communicating is a warning, because I think what's interesting is when we bring back in that point, right, that humanity is currently on the tracks in the train, barreling down towards this destination. We are already condemned because we're in the pit that Adam has placed all of humanity into. We were born into that condemnation, and that's where we were going. And yet Jesus, through his life, his death, and his sacrifice, has provided us a way to get off of those tracks, off of that train, and move in another direction, right, to the life and the eternity and the relationship with God that we were actually created for, that we were actually designed for. And I think what's interesting with that is that what we see is that both in life and after death, it's either thy will be done or my will be done. Right? In life and after death, it's either thy will be done or my will be done. That we either have the opportunity to trust in Jesus and to submit to him as our ultimate authority and move into the life that we are not only commanded to, but created for our joy and our delight, or we can choose to reject that and continue on the trajectory that we are already on. And so in life and after death, it's either thy will be done or my will be done. And I think that's why C.S. Lewis has this quote where he says, the doors of hell are locked from the inside, right? Because we're presented with the opportunity to trust in Jesus or to continue in the trajectory that we're already heading. Right. Now, I want to mention one other thing here. And I think there's just this question, right, that you're saying, okay, you've been walking through what the Bible teaches, what the Bible says about all of these things. And that's great for people who believe in the Bible, but what if that's not me, right? What if the Bible isn't something that I'm necessarily down with? Is there anything that you can give me to help me think around these things that comes from something else? And to that end, what I would say is, I think there is a really good argument that plays into how we understand eternity that doesn't deal with the Bible at all. And essentially, it's an argument from desire. And this is how it works. It's really a three-step argument that tees up and shows how heaven is actually what we are designed and created for. And this is how it goes. These are the three steps. It says this, that first off, the first step is that all desires, all natural desires, have a real corresponding satisfaction. All natural desires have a real corresponding satisfaction, which is something that we can verify even from our own experience, that we experience hunger because we are designed in such a way that food is for our benefit. And hunger is the thing that tells us that we need food. And so it leads us to food, which is the object that actually satisfies that desire. Right? In the same way that when we are fatigued, sleep is what satisfies that. We desire rest and there's vacation. We desire beauty and there's mountains and oceans. We desire love and there are relationships, right? For every natural desire, there is some object that satisfies it, that's for our good. And if you think about it, it would be the strangest thing ever. It would just be plain odd for us to be designed in such a way that we desired something that had no object, nothing that could actually satisfy it, right? To have a desire for which nothing satisfied it, right? That would be like feeling hunger without even having a body that had the capacity to eat or had the need to eat. That would be like desiring sleep without even having the capacity to actually sleep. And so All that to say, all natural desires have a real corresponding satisfaction. That's the first step. The second one is this, that humans naturally desire something which cannot be met in this world. Humans naturally desire something which cannot be met in this world. That's to say that every single one of us is marked by this desire, this longing, this restlessness, this wistful longing for something that nothing in this world can satisfy. There's quotes that every person has, I think it's William Blake who said that every person is born with a God-shaped vacuum in their heart, right? Ecclesiastes 3:14 says that God has placed eternity in our hearts, which is a way of saying that there's something about this life where we long for something more, a desire that can't be satisfied, right? Even the prophet Bono says, I still haven't found what I'm looking for. There is something that we long for in this life, and there is nothing in this world that can satisfy it. And so when you take these 2 points and you put them together, what that leads us to is this third idea, the conclusion, that some real object must exist beyond this world which satisfies this human desire. Right? If all natural desires have some object that satisfies them, and if we have a desire that nothing in this world satisfies, then there must be something beyond this world that does satisfy that desire, which is God in heaven. Right? And what this shows us is that what we desire, what we long for, is something that is met exactly by the plan that God has communicated, that our desires actually correspond to the plan that God has communicated to us in the gospel and in the Bible. That what we long for, right, in our heart of hearts is a resurrected life in a resurrected body with a resurrected Christ on a resurrected earth. And for that reason, what our desires lead us to is this understanding that heaven is absolutely real, that the description of eternity with God is absolutely what we long for. And when we finally reach that place by trusting in Jesus, the deepest desires that we have ever known in this life will be finally satisfied in the fullest way that we have ever known. And so even just by looking at our desires, we can come to see and understand that we are created for something more than just this life. All right. Now, I do want to make a quick plug here that if you want to go deeper into heaven and hell, if you have questions about these things, there's just a couple of different sources that I think would be really helpful. One would be the Fully Delighted podcast, which is a podcast here at SMCC, where through this series, we're taking a deeper dive into each one of these topics. And so I'd encourage you to check that out. And then also, SMCCU this fall is starting up with classes. And there's one particular class that I think would be fantastic if you want to go deeper on this topic, on these topics, and that would be what Christians believe. And if you're at the Draper campus, let me just say that that's the class that Mike Bell teaches, and it is fantastic. You will love it, and you will get an especially deep dive into all of these things we've been talking about today. So I'd encourage you to check that out and get signed up. All right, now as we get ready to close, let me just say this, right, that death demands our attention. It's not necessarily a burden that we feel each and every day or every hour or minute of every day, but there are moments where things occur and all of a sudden we're confronted with the reality of our own mortality, that one day we will die. And the question arises for us, what happens after? What is waiting for me on the other side? And I think your religion says that there is nothing, right? You just cease to exist, and so there's nothing to be worried about, which I think anyone who's clung to that answer as they've moved towards death has found it's not the most satisfying or comforting reality. Religion says you just need to be good enough, just perform well enough. But how do you know how good is good enough? Especially when the Bible seems to indicate pretty clearly in Revelation 20 and 21 that it is only those who stand before God on the basis of Jesus that even stand a hope. And so what the gospel says is not either of those things. It doesn't say that good people go to heaven and that bad people go to hell, but what the Bible communicates to us, what the gospel says, is that forgiven people go to Jesus. Right? What happens after I die? Forgiven people go to Jesus. So I want to invite you to consider embracing this truth as one of your own, right? Because this is why we believe this as a church. It's why we've built our church upon it, but you have a doctrinal statement for your life as well. And I want to invite you to consider embracing this truth as one that you build, not just your life, but your eternity upon also. And I think this is what it sounds like to do that. I accept that humanity is already under condemnation and death is proof. I accept that Jesus provides the only way out of condemnation, and the empty grave is proof. I accept that I will be with Jesus forever, and that's what makes it heaven. Because the truth is, right, at some point, we all have to wrestle with that question in different seasons of our lives. And when we cling to this answer, when we build our lives on this, what it gives us the ability to do is that when death commands our attention, when it demands our attention, we have an answer to turn to for comfort. Because the bottom line is, if death demands your attention, Jesus should have your allegiance. If death demands your attention, Jesus should have your allegiance. Because what trusting in Jesus gives you the ability to do, even as you move through your life and to the end of it, is to move towards that end, trusting in Jesus with peace and with joy and with certainty, knowing that even on the other side of death, what awaits you is something better. Because the truth is, the best is yet to come for those who have built their life and their eternity on Jesus. So I want to invite you to consider doing that. Would you pray with me? Jesus, we thank you for your word. We thank you that you do give us answers, that you don't leave us wondering about what happens to us after we die, but that in your word you give us a lot of information. You tell us about heaven. You tell us about hell. You tell us the truth about our current state and condition, and you give us this wonderful opportunity, this offer of trusting in you to move forward into the eternity that we were always designed for. So we thank you and we praise you for that. We thank you for the comfort it offers to us. We thank you for the comfort of truth. In your name, amen.
Who am I that the highest would welcome me? I was lost, but he brought me in. Oh, his love for me. Oh, his love for me.
chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am.
I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. Oh, I am who you say I am. Yes, I am who you say I am. Who the Son sets free, who is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am.
I hope that you enjoyed the message today. And as always, I'd really like to thank the hundreds of families that support SMCC financially each week. That partnership allows us to reach thousands of people every weekend across our locations and also many more through SMCC online. So thank you so much for choosing to partner with SMCC financially. And if you'd like more information about what it looks like to start that, or maybe just even investigate and see what that even looks like, you can visit smccutah.org/give. Now, I will be back here next week with Pastor Eric as we go into a subject that I think applies to both you and I, or at least you might be curious about. Next week, we are talking about the church as we continue in our Redeeming Dogma series. Thank you again for being here today, and I hope to see you again next week.